Okay, I am now going to continue the story. It's very exciting, but there's so many different names in it, I hope it doesn't get too confusing. But you are a smart boy, and I think you'll remember. But if you ever have trouble remembering, you can always go back and watch a story again, to see if there's something that you can't remember. Okay? Here we go. Harun had plenty more questions to ask. Why did the Chuckwallas live in permanent night? Must it not be very cold indeed if the sun never shone at all? And what was Beelzebub, or a cult master? Come to that. But they were evidently nearing Gup City, because the waters around them and the skies above were filling with mechanical birds every bit as weird as but the hoopoe. Birds with snake heads and peacock tails, those are tails with all kinds of sort of eyes all over them. Flying fishes, dog birds. And on the backs of the birds were water genies, with whiskers of every possible color, all wearing turbans and embroidered waistcoats and banana-shaped pajamas, all looking so much like If that it was a good thing, in Harun's opinion, that the colors of their whiskers were different enough to make it possible to tell them apart. Something most serious has occurred, If commented. All units have been ordered back to base. Now, if I had my disconnecting tool, he added sharply, I would have received the order myself because, of course, thieflets, talking about Harun, little thieves, thieflets do not know there is a highly advanced transceiver built into the handle, so it's like a radio. Luckily, however, Harun came back just as sharply, since you half poisoned me with that dirty story, you work things out so there's no harm done except, perhaps, to me. If ignored this, and Harun's attention was distracted as well, because he noticed that a large patch of what looked like a particularly thick and tough type of weed or vegetable of some sort was actually racing along beside them, keeping pace with But the Hoopoe without apparent effort, while it waved vegetable tentacles in the air in a most disturbing fashion. At the center of the mobile or moving vegetable patch was a single lilac flower. We have lilacs here in Saugerties. They're purple and they smell wonderful. With thick fleshy leaves of a type Harun had never seen before. What's that? He inquired, pointing, even though he knew it was impolite to point. A floating gardener, naturally, said But the Hoopoe without moving his beak. That made no sense. You mean a floating garden, Harun corrected the bird, which gave a little snort. That's all you know, Harun. At that moment, the high-speed vegetation actually reared up out of the water and proceeded to wind and knot itself around and about until it had taken something like the shape of a man, with the lilac-colored flower positioned as its sort of head where a mouth should be, and a cluster of weeds forming a kind of old-looking hat. So it is a floating gardener after all, Harun realized. A gardener is a person working in the garden. The floating gardener was now running lightly over the surface of the water, showing no sign of sinking. How could he sink? But the Hoopoe interjected. Would he not be a sinking gardener in that case? Whereas, as you observe, he floats, he runs, he walks, he hops. No problem. If called across to the gardener, who at once nodded a brief greeting. Got a stranger with you? Very odd. Still, your own business, he said. His voice was as soft as flower petals. After all, he was actually speaking through those lilac flower lips. But his manner was somewhat abrupt. I thought all you guppies were chatterboxes, Harun whispered to If. But this gardener doesn't say much. He is talkative, if rejoined or responded, for a gardener anyway. How do you do? Your grandma is a gardener, but she talks. How do you do? Harun called across to the gardener, thinking that, as he was the stranger, it was his business to introduce himself. Who are you? The gardener asked in his soft but abrupt way, without breaking his movement, or stride. Stride means, when you're walking, you stride. Harun told him his name, and the gardener gave another short nod. Molly, he said, floating gardener, first class. That's his name. Please, Harun said in his nicest voice, what does the floating gardener do? Maintenance, which means taking care of things, answered Molly. Untwisting twisted story streams, and unlooping the same. Weeding, that's pulling out things that don't belong there. In short, gardening. Think of the ocean as a head of hair, said Dr. Hoopo helpfully. Imagine it's full of story streams as a thick head of hair full of soft, flowing strands of hair. The longer and thicker a head of hair, the knottier and more tangled it gets, like Danny. Floating gardeners, you could say, are like the hairdressers of the sea of stories. Brushed, clean, washed, conditioned. So now you know. If, asked Molly, what's this pollution? When did it start? How bad is it? Molly answered the questions in sequence. Lethal. That means it'll kill you. But nature, as yet unknown, started only recently, but spread very rapidly. How bad? Very bad. Certain types of story may take years to clean up. For example, Harun piped up, certain popular romances have become long lists of shopping expeditions. Children's stories also. For instance, there is an outbreak of talking helicopter stories. I guess what the point is that that's pretty dopey. With that, Molly felt silent, and the rush to Gup City continued. Wow, so the pollution is screwing up all the stories in the stream of stories in the ocean. A few minutes later, however, Harun heard more new voices. They were like choruses, many voices at a time, speaking in perfect unison. And they were full of fresh froth. Froth is like the stuff on top of beer, and bubbles. Finally, Harun worked out that they were actually coming up from beneath the surface of the ocean. He looked down into the waters and saw two fearsome sea monsters right beside the racing hoopoe, swimming so close to the surface that they were almost surfing on the spray thrown up by Buck as he spread along. I sometimes forget that they're under the water all this time, and all these things flying around are in the water. But that's true of, there are birds like certain kinds of ducks that can swim underneath the water and catch fish, and when they dive into the water, they move their wings just like they do in the air, and they sort of fly in the water. The reason is that water, in some ways, is just like air. In fact, in science, it's called a fluid. Air is a fluid, and water is a fluid. But water is a very thick fluid, and air is a very thin fluid. That's a little science. I know this is like being in school, but you will forgive Grandpa for that, won't you? I know you will. From their roughly triangular shape and their very bright, glowing coloring, Harun figured out that they were angelfish of some variety, although they were as big as giant sharks and had literally dozens of mouths all over their bodies. These mouths were constantly at work, sucking in story streams and blowing them out again, pausing only to speak. And when they did so, Harun noted, each mouth spoke with its own voice, but all the mouths on each individual fish spoke perfectly synchronized words. In other words, they all spoke at the same time, but they all spoke exactly the same words at the same pace so that it all came out like a chorus of voices. Hurry, hurry, don't be late, bubbled the first fish. Ocean's ailing, cure can't wait, the second went on. But the hoopoe was once again kind enough to enlighten the Saroon. These are plenty more fishes, it said. They acquired a good name from the fact that you have no doubt registered, that is, that they have plenty of maws, that is, mouth. A maw, M-A-W in English, is the same thing as a mouth. You could ask why are there two words for the same thing, and Grandma will say, I don't know. So, thought Haroon, filled with wonder, there really are plenty more fish in the sea, just as old Snooty Batu said. And I have traveled a long way, just as my father said, and I've learned that a plenty more fish can be an angelfish as well. Now that's a joke. If you remember, the politician said there are plenty more fish in the sea. In other words, if you lost one thing, you could always find another, like he lost his mother. But this is plenty more spelled differently. So it's like a joke. It's the same word, but spelled differently. And if you don't get it now, I'll explain it when I see you. Plenty more fishes always go in twos, Bud added without moving its beak. They are faithful to partners for life. And to express the perfect union, they speak only and always in rhyme. Did they? Yes, they did. Hurry, hurry, don't be late. Ocean's ailing, cure can't wait. That was a rhyme. These particular plenty more fishes seemed unhealthy to Haroon. Their multiple mouths frequently spluttered and coughed, and their eyes looked inflamed and pink. I'm no expert, Haroon called to them, but are you both quite well? The replies came swiftly, punctuated by bubbling coughs. All this bad taste, too much dirt. Swimming in the ocean starts to hurt. Call me Bagha. This is Goopy. Excuse our rudeness. We feel droopy. I feel roomy. Roomy means looking sick, sort of like running. Throat feels sore. When we're better, we'll talk more. As you correctly guessed, all groupies love to talk, it said, as an aside. Silence is often considered rude. Hey, that's like Grandpa. That's like, Yotam. We like to talk a lot, don't we? Hence the plenty more's apology. They seem to be talking okay to me, Carew replied. Normally each mouth says something different, if we explained. That makes plenty more talk. For them, this is like silence. Whereas for a floating gardener, a few short sentences are called talkativeness, Carew sighed. I don't think I'll ever get the hang of this play. In other words, to understand it. What do the fish do anyway? If replied that the plenty more fishes were what he called hunger artists, because when they are hungry, they swallow stories through every mouth, and in their insides, miracles occur. One little bit of one story joins on to an idea of another. And hey, presto, when they spew out the stories, that sounds like they make a cocky of stories, doesn't it? Spewing out their tuchuses, no doubt. They are not old stories, but new ones. Nothing comes from nothing. Thieflet, that's again because Haroon a little thief. No story comes from nowhere. New stories are born from old. It is the new combinations that make them new. So you see, our artistic plenty more fishes really create new stories in their digestive systems. Just think how sick they must be feeling now. All these filthy up stories passing through their inside, front to back, top to bottom, side to side. No longer they look green around the gills. You know, gills, fish have gills. The plenty more circuit to say one more wheezy couplet. Things are worse than we've ever known. and the worst place is down in our old zone. On hearing this, the water genie clapped his hand to his forehead, almost dislodging his turban, which was on top of his head. What? What? Harun insisted on knowing. For, and now, and now even more preoccupied if, grudgingly explained that the old zone in the southern polar region, at the South Pole, of Kahani, was an area to which hardly anyone went anymore. There was little demand for the ancient old stories flowing there. You know how people are, new things, always new. The old tales, nobody cares. And so the old zone has fallen into disuse. But it was believed that all the streams of stories had originated long ago in one of the currents flowing north across the ocean from the wellspring, or the source of stories, that was located, according to legend, near the moon's south pole. And if the source itself is poison, what will happen to the ocean? To us all, if almost whales cried. We have ignored it for too long, and now we pay the price. If I may just say, that's a little bit like our world, getting polluted everywhere, and we better hurry up and do something about it. Hold on to hats, but the Hoopoe interrupted. Hitting the brake now. Gup City dead ahead. Record time. Va-va-va-boom. No problem. It's amazing what you can get accustomed to, and at what speed, Harun reflected. This new world, these new friends, have just arrived, and already none of it seems very strange at all. Gup City was all excitement and activity. Waterways crisscrossed the city in every direction. For the capital of the land of Gup was built upon an archipelago. An archipelago is, I think, like a rock formation that sticks out of the ocean, of 1,001 small islands just off the mainland. I guess an archipelago is a bunch of islands. And I didn't know either. And at present, these waterways were crowded with ships and boats of every shape and size, all packed with guppy citizens, who were similarly diverse, and who all wore worried expressions on their faces. But the Hoopoe, with Malay on one side, and Guppy and Baka, those are the plenty more fishes, on the other, advanced more slowly now through this floating crowd, heading, like everyone else, to the lagoon. The lagoon, a beautiful expanse of multicolored waters, stood between the archipelago, where most guppies made their homes, in very detailed, carved wooden buildings with roofs of silver and gold, and the mainland, where a gigantic formal garden came down in terraces. Terraces are like, walls built up on a mountain, each one lower than the other, right to the water's edge. In this pleasure garden were fountains and pleasure domes and ancient spreading trees, and around it were the three most important buildings in Gup, which looked like a trio of gigantic and very elaborate, meaning very fancy, iced cakes with icing on top. The palace of King Chatterjee, with its grand balcony overlooking the garden. To its right, the parliament, that's the government, like the Knesset of Gup, known as the Chatterbox, because debates there could run on for weeks. Debates are when people argue back and forth, with weeks or months or even occasionally years, on account of the guppy fondness for conversation. And to its left, to the left of the palace, the towering edifice of P2C2E House, a huge building from which whirs and clanks were constantly heard, and inside which were concealed 1,001 machines too complicated to describe, which controlled the processes too complicated to explain. Okay? I'm going to stop now, and I will continue in a moment.